As the lawyer read Article 12, the polished leather of the boardroom chairs groaned beneath the shifting weight of the people who thought they had won. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, my service uniform stiff against my shoulders, listening to the cap table on the wall monitors shift from green to cold, accusing red. Melissa stared at the screen, her manicured fingers twitching against the glass of ice water she refused to drink. Cole tried to interrupt, his voice cracking slightly as he claimed the clause could not possibly touch their founder's shares. The lawyer did not even look up from the certified document in his hands. He simply reminded them that while their economic interest remained intact, not a single voting share belonged to them anymore. I did not smile. I looked past Melissa's trembling shoulders toward the back of the room where Calvin Ward sat, his hands resting quietly on the arms of his chair, staring at the empty badge pocket on his chest. Melissa snapped her head around, her eyes wide with a frantic, cornered fury. She hissed that I had engineered the whole thing from the shadows. I told her plainly that I had warned her not to sign the termination authorization without an independent review. She screamed that I had stood right there in the room and let her do it. She was right. I had not stopped her. I did not offer a defense, and I did not flinch under the weight of her hatred. 18 days earlier, I had walked into my father memorial believing the worst fight of the season would be over how to divide his shares. I had flown back into Memphis from a logistics deployment late the previous afternoon, checked into a quiet room at a roadside hotel near the airport, and spent the night ironing my service uniform so it would be sharp by morning. When I arrived at Reeves Freight Recovery at dawn, the air inside the main corridor smelled sharply of burnt coffee from the breakroom urn, mixed with the damp, industrial tang of machine oil drifting up from the dispatch floor and the stale dust embedded deep in the heavy gray carpets. Melissa stood by the reception desk, greeting guests with the practiced grace of a grieving widow who had already measured the drapes. Cole had prepared a video presentation that looped silent clips of veterans working alongside my father, though the glossy corporate soundtrack he chose drowned out the actual sound of their voices. Later, trapped inside my father's old corner office, Melissa made it clear that my presence was nothing more than an unwelcome reminder of a family she wanted to forget. Cole reminded me that I had walked away from the family home 16 years ago to build a life in the military. I did not apologize for my career, and I did not soften my tone. I told them both that I owned 10% of this company, and I intended to read every financial report and shareholder notice that crossed my desk. That afternoon, a heavy manila envelope arrived by courier, addressed to me personally from a corporate law firm in Delaware. Inside was a single sheet of stiff paper confirming my status as a family block beneficiary and containing a brief instruction on who to contact if a workforce covenant event ever occurred. There was no full copy of the agreement inside, and when I called the number listed, the receptionist told me the firm could only discuss the matter after a triggering action had been formally executed. At the end of the memorial reception, as the last visitors cleared out toward the parking lot, Melissa paused by the glass partition overlooking the warehouse floor. She watched the mechanics and dispatchers cleaning up the folding chairs, her mouth tightening into a thin, bitter line. She muttered to Cole that the business could no longer afford to carry the financial burden of my father's old promises. I caught the tail end of the sentence as I walked past with my briefcase. Cole leaned in close to her ear, his expression smooth and calculated, and told her to give him 3 weeks to clean payroll and close the warehouse deal before anyone knew what hit them. The morning after the memorial, the air inside the dispatch floor carried the steady metallic hum of 20 active routing consoles and the sharp chemical tang of industrial cleaner. Calvin Ward stood beside the main tracking board, his posture rigid, leaning slightly toward his left side where his prosthetic leg met the reinforced steel frame of his boot. He did not look up when I approached, his fingers moving across the keyboard with a practiced rhythm that ignored the missing digits on his right hand. I watched him trace a shipping route, across the digital map of the Mid-South region, tracking a convoy of medical supplies scheduled to bypass a severe thunderstorm rolling in from the Delta. That kind of routing took 20 years of institutional memory, years of knowing which county roads washed out first when the river crested. Calvin did not manage spreadsheets from a leather chair. He managed human lives in motion, keeping trucks rolling through ice storms and midnight highway closures because my father had built a company on the simple premise that men and women who had carried rifles in foreign mud deserved a desk where their discipline mattered, more than corporate buzzwords. Later that morning, Cole summoned the senior administrative staff to the glass-walled conference room for what he called a modernization briefing. He clicked through a slide deck filled with automated logistics, software logos, and efficiency metrics, his voice carrying that smooth, rehearsed cadence common to men who had never loaded a pallet in their lives. He clicked to a chart showing operational overhead, pointing a laser pointer at a highlighted line item that he labeled accommodation costs and special wage structures. Cole claimed those legacy expenses were dragging down our profit margins and choking the company ability to scale into regional markets. Rochelle Hayes shifted in her chair near the end of the long oak table, her hand resting near the small digital amplifier clipped to her collar. She adjusted the device slightly before she spoke, her voice level and devoid of any defensive heat. Rochelle asked Cole where he pulled the baseline numbers for the accommodation line item, pointing out that those figures lumped general warehouse maintenance together with specialized ergonomic workstation adjustments required by federal compliance standards. Cole blinked, his rehearsed smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he dismissed her question with a wave of his hand, claiming the raw data packets were proprietary and restricted to executive leadership. He moved on to his next slide without answering, closing the meeting abruptly before anyone else could speak. I stayed in my seat after the others cleared out, closing my leather folio with a deliberate snap that echoed in the quiet room. I looked across the polished wood at my brother and reminded him quietly that under our current corporate bylaws, any 10% shareholder had the legal right to review board packets and operational ledgers upon written request. Cole leaned back in his executive chair, crossing his arms over his tailored shirt, and told me that board packets were reserved exclusively for voting directors, not absentee military officers who wandered back home only when there was an estate to pick clean. I did not raise my voice, and I did not let his provocation shift my breathing. I reached into my bag, pulled out a formal printed request citing our corporate governance statutes, slid it across the table until it touched the base of his laptop, and told him he had 48 hours to deliver to explain his refusal to corporate counsel. That evening, the tension migrated to the dining room table in the sprawling suburban house my father had built 20 miles outside of Memphis. Melissa sat at the head of the table, her fork hovering over a plate of roast beef she had barely touched. The room smelled faintly of heavy floral perfume and melted tallow from the silver candlesticks she insisted on lighting every night, even when we ate alone. Melissa broke the silence by setting her silverware down with a sharp clink against the china, accusing me of treating her home like a military barracks and treating her husband's memory like a legal battlefield. She said my father had spent his final years exhausted, constantly bailing out ungrateful veterans who used his compassion as a crutch, and she blamed them for stealing the retirement years they should have spent traveling the world together. I set my napkin beside my plate, looking straight across the table into her bloodshot, defensive eyes, and told her plainly that my father chose every single person who worked in that warehouse because they were the best logisticians in the state, not out of charity. Melissa slammed her palm against the polished wood of the table, shouting that I knew nothing about the sacrifices she had made, nothing about the sleepless nights she spent listening to my father worry over payroll, while I was thousands of miles away playing soldier. Before I could answer, the sharp ring of her cellular phone cut through the dining room air. Melissa snatched the device from the tabletop, her expression tightening into an anxious scowl as she checked the caller identification. She pushed her chair back, muttering under her breath about incompetent bankers who did not understand temporary cash flow issues, and hurried down the hallway toward the sunroom, leaving the heavy oak door cracked open just enough for her raised voice to bleed through. I sat quietly in the dimming light of the dining room, listening to the muffled urgency of her conversation through the gap in the door. She was arguing with a commercial lender about a bridge loan maturity date, demanding an extension on a monthly payment that carried a six-figure price tag, her voice shifting from haughty corporate authority to desperate pleading. When the latch clicked and she hurried back toward the kitchen, she caught me looking her way, snatched a stack of unopened mail off the sideboard to hide her trembling fingers, and barked at me to mind my own business before retreating upstairs to her bedroom. By the end of that week, I needed to see the actual operations on the ground, away from Cole's spreadsheet projections and Melissa's frantic phone calls. Luis Alvarez met me at the loading dock of our largest distribution facility off the interstate, a massive steel and concrete building that Cole had repeatedly dismissed in board discussions as a dead asset draining company resources. Luis walked me through the cavernous bays where forklifts moved with smooth, synchronized precision, guiding me past rows of medical supplies destined for regional hospitals and emergency shelters. Luis stopped beside a stack of outbound crates, wrapped in heavy plastic, his hand resting firmly on the wooden pallet as he explained how their custom route planning software saved the company thousands of dollars in fuel and transit time every single month. He told me that despite what the executive suite claimed, this specific warehouse had not operated at a net loss for a single quarter in the last 5 years, maintaining a positive cash flow that quietly subsidized the newer, unproven branches across the state. I asked him if he kept a duplicate record of those shipping manifests and financial receipts outside the main corporate server network. Luis shook his head slowly, his weathered face lined with honest frustration, and told me that all digital logs fed directly into the centralized company mainframe, controlled by Cole Department, leaving the warehouse managers with little more than the physical customer delivery receipts signed at the loading bays. He handed me a thick manila folder containing copies of those customer certifications, reminding me that while the digital data lived on corporate servers where files could be manipulated, the signed delivery receipts sitting in his office cabinet represented undeniable proof of active, profitable operations. I thanked Luis, slid the folder securely into my briefcase, and drove straight back to the corporate headquarters to drop a formal warning shot across their bows. I drafted a comprehensive email to Melissa, Cole, and the corporate legal department, attaching copies of the customer certifications and citing specific fiduciary risks associated with mass workforce terminations or premature asset sales. I wrote that any attempt to dismantle the core operating team or liquidate company real estate without an independent financial review and formal trustee approval would constitute a severe breach of fiduciary duty and potential discrimination under federal statutes. Within 20 minutes of sending the message, my phone chimed on the passenger seat of my car as I sat in the parking lot. I picked it up to find a brief reply from Melissa written entirely in aggressive capital letters telling me that I did not run this company and I had better stay out of her way. I replied instantly with a single sentence that left no room for misinterpretation, telling her that neither did she without the documents she continued to refuse to read. The next morning, the corporate counsel office called me directly, his voice dropping to a cautious, measured tone as he weighed every syllable against potential liability. He told me that my father workforce covenant was indeed real and enforceable under the legacy shareholder agreements, but he added that he could not legally tell me what specific action would activate it until someone in executive leadership formally proposed the termination motion on the record. I hung up the phone in the silent cabin of my car, realizing that we were standing right on the edge of a precipice, waiting for the other side to make a move they could never take back. The morning sun cut across the manicured lawns outside Reeves Freight Recovery, casting long, sharp shadows over the asphalt where employees had parked their cars for 20 years. I stepped through the glass double doors wearing my service uniform, the heavy wool jacket buttoned tight against the crisp November air, medals pinned neatly above my left pocket for an anniversary ceremony honoring the company founding rather than any military command. Melissa stood near the atrium banner, smiling warmly for the visiting regional photographers while leaning against a large promotional poster that featured 3 disabled veterans smiling beside my father. Her tailored silk blouse caught the glare of the overhead lights, and she greeted the handful of local chamber members who had arrived early with a practiced, breathless enthusiasm that masked the nervous twitch of her fingers against her handbag. I took my place at the podium when the program began, delivering a short, deliberate speech that focused entirely on operational capability, logistics precision, and the irreplaceable value of discipline, refusing to couch their service in the language of charity or pity. When the applause faded and the last visitor filed out toward the parking lot, Melissa did not wait for the auditorium to empty before she made her move. She motioned sharply to Human Resources, instructing them to secure the double doors leading back to the administrative offices, and summon every member of the covered veteran workforce into the main training room down the hall. I followed them down the carpeted corridor, my boots clicking with a steady, measured rhythm against the floor, while the heavy murmur of confused employees echoed against the drywall. 24 men and women filled the rows of blue plastic chairs, some leaning on crutches, others adjusting hearing aids or wheelchair brakes, their faces shifting from polite curiosity to quiet apprehension, as Melissa swept into the front of the room with Cole trailing close behind her like a shadow. Melissa did not bother with pleasantries or preamble, choosing instead to stand behind the lectern with her chin tilted upward in a posture of absolute authority. She announced clearly that the company was moving in a bold new direction, explaining that modern logistics required automated efficiency rather than sentimental indulgence. She stated flatly that Reeves Freight Recovery would no longer operate as a rehabilitation center for old soldiers who could no longer keep pace with market demands. Then she dropped the blow that silenced the room completely. "Fire them all," Melissa said. Before the echoes of those words could settle against the acoustic ceiling tiles, security guards stepped out from the side corridors, handing thick, manila termination packets to each person seated in the rows, while simultaneously reaching for the ID badges clipped to their collars. I pushed forward through the doorway, my hands flattening against the wooden edge of the front table as I looked directly across at Melissa. I told her to stop immediately and order an independent review before taking an action that violated shareholder protections and destroyed the core of the business. Melissa turned her head slowly, her lips curling into a cold, superior smile, as she asked me if I honestly believed I had the legal authority to counter an executive decision made by the majority owner. I looked her in the eye and answered with brutal honesty, telling her that I did not hold a board seat and could not unilaterally block her command, but she was driving the company straight off a cliff. Melissa refused to listen, grabbing a black ink pen from the podium and slamming her signature onto the master authorization document right in front of me. Calvin Ward stood up slowly from the second row, his hand gripping the back of the plastic chair to steady his weight as he looked past Melissa toward where I stood in my uniform. He asked me directly if I had known this purge was coming down the pipeline before today. I told him quietly that I knew the risk existed, but I had never imagined the list would encompass every single veteran on the payroll. Calvin stared at me for a long, painful moment, his expression hardening as the realization set in. "You knew enough to prepare," Calvin said, his voice dropping into a flat, gravelly register that cut deeper than any shout. "You just did not trust us enough to tell us." I did not offer an excuse, and I did not look away from his accusing gaze as he turned and walked out of the room without his badge. Stepping out into the hallway, I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Trust Counsel directly, bypassing the corporate switchboard to confirm our emergency financial safety net. The attorney on the other line verified that the legacy trust established by my father contained a designated emergency reserve specifically earmarked to provide bridge pay and health insurance premiums for displaced workers if a workforce covenant event was officially triggered. It was not my personal money, and it could not buy back their trust, but it would keep their families fed and their medications covered while the legal machinery ground into motion. I sent a secure digital list of legal aid resources to the lead representatives, refusing to make hollow promises about reinstating their jobs before the paperwork caught up with reality. Back inside the executive offices, Melissa was already tightening the screws on the departing workers, issuing a strict administrative memo through Human Resources that withheld all accumulated vacation pay and severance disbursements unless each individual signed a comprehensive liability release waiver. Corporate counsel fired off an urgent warning email advising her that withholding earned wages violated state labor regulations, but Melissa ignored the message entirely, deleting it from her screen as if erasing the words made them untrue. Unknown to her, the entire training room briefing had been captured from start to finish because Human Resources had scheduled the gathering as a formal Microsoft Teams meeting to ensure regional managers who could not travel could review compliance protocols remotely. The company server automatically archived the video file, complete with a precise timestamp, organizer logs, and a full participant list, locking away an immutable digital witness that would soon become the cornerstone of our entire case. 2 business days later, the formal shockwave hit the executive boardroom when the state-registered agent delivered certified copies of the triggering notice directly to our office. Melissa New corporate attorney sat at the center of the mahogany table, adjusting his reading glasses with trembling fingers as he unfolded the heavy parchment containing Article 12 of the restated shareholder agreement. He cleared his throat nervously and read the operative clauses aloud to the silent room, confirming that terminating 24 covered veteran employees in a single administrative action without independent review, financial emergency proof, or employee trustee approval constituted an automatic breach of the foundational covenant. He looked up from the paper, his voice thin and strained as he delivered the final verdict. As of the moment the 24th termination became effective, he said, the Veteran Employee Stewardship Trust controlled every single voting share in this room. Melissa slammed her hands onto the table, her face draining of color as she stared at the cap table monitor on the wall, which was already shifting its status indicators from green to locked red. She whipped her head around toward me, her voice breaking with frantic denial. "You let me do this," Melissa hissed. I stood at the head of the table in my crisp service uniform, my hands resting quietly on the back of my chair, watching the absolute certainty drain out of her eyes. I told her that she had been warned by counsel, warned by the bylaws, and warned by me, but she had chosen her path anyway. The voting power was gone, the board was paralyzed, and the reckoning she thought she had escaped was only just beginning to wake up. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open, and the 5 interim employee trustees stepped into the room with quiet, steady footsteps that immediately commanded the space. Calvin Ward walked at the front of the group, his hand resting lightly on the back of a chair while his eyes locked onto Melissa with an unreadable, level expression. Trust counsel followed closely behind, carrying a thick leather briefcase filled with certified governance documents, establishing a new power dynamic before a single word was spoken aloud. Melissa tried to maintain her posture at the head of the long oak table, but her fingers gripped the edge of the polished wood so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. She demanded to know by what authority these workers presumed to occupy executive chambers, spitting out accusations that a hostile coup had taken place. Trust counsel calmly stepped forward, opened a certified portfolio, and reminded her that Article 12 of the restated shareholder agreement explicitly transferred all voting control of the founder block to the Employee Stewardship Trust the moment her mass termination order became effective. Cole slammed his palm against the tabletop, his face flushing with an angry red, as he shouted that the trust was nothing more than an administrative fiction designed to steal a legitimate family business. He claimed his executive authority remained absolute over daily operations and asset management. The lead trustee, a veteran logistics dispatcher who had worked under my father for 2 decades, looked straight across the table at Cole and informed him that his executive authority now required dual authorization from the newly formed special committee for any financial transaction exceeding $500. I sat quietly near the corner of the room, my hands folded neatly over my leather folio, watching the reality of their sudden helplessness sink into their expressions. Melissa turned her furious glare toward me, demanding to know what secret promises I had made to the trustees to engineer this takeover. Trust counsel intervened before I could answer, setting the legal record straight for everyone present. He stated plainly that I held 0 voting rights during the protective guardianship period and possessed no power to self-appoint to any executive office, proving to Melissa that my own voting power had vanished alongside hers. The realization hit Melissa like a physical blow, stripping away her haughty corporate demeanor and leaving behind the frantic panic of a woman whose financial survival hung by a thread. Without missing a beat, the trustees introduced their first official resolution, moving unanimously to formally rescind the mass termination orders, restore active employee badges, reinstate full healthcare benefits, and authorize retroactive back pay for every single veteran who had been thrown out into the hallway days earlier. Not every veteran accepted reinstatement immediately, as some preferred to let their private attorneys review the fallout before returning to a workplace that had betrayed them, but the legal mechanism of protection was firmly locked in place. Cole scrambled to regain control of the narrative, opening his laptop and shoving a printed financial projection toward the center of the table with desperate urgency. He warned the trustees that halting the pending warehouse sale to Blue Cedar Logistics Properties would instantly trigger a catastrophic cash crisis, claiming the company had less than 30 days of operational liquidity remaining before payroll bounced and lenders foreclosed on every asset we owned. He argued that selling the distribution centers was the only lifeline keeping the business alive, painting himself as the sole protector of our corporate survival. Special committee counsel reviewed Cole projection sheets for a long moment before sliding them back across the table with a cold, dismissive motion. Instead of accepting his panic, the committee exercised its newly minted voting power to issue formal preservation notices to the commercial buyer, the primary banking institutions, the state-registered agent, and our disaster recovery IT vendors, legally freezing every single asset transfer and property deed associated with the warehouse transaction. Blue Cedar Logistics Properties responded within hours through their corporate legal representation, filing a sharp letter of protest and threatening immediate civil litigation for breach of contract if the closing was delayed by a single day. Sensing that his financial house of cards was beginning to collapse around him, Cole launched a vicious counterattack designed to destroy my credibility among the staff and management teams. By late afternoon, his administrative assistants had distributed a confidential internal email packet to every department head across the company, leaking correspondence between myself and trust counsel that had taken place prior to the mass termination event. Cole added his own venomous commentary to the broadcast, framing my preparatory inquiries as proof that I had known about the workforce covenant all along and had deliberately baited Melissa into firing the veterans so the trust could seize voting control. The leaked emails created an immediate wave of distrust among the workers who were still processing the trauma of their brief dismissal. Several department managers who had previously looked to me as a stabilizing presence now avoided my gaze in the hallways, whispering among themselves that I had treated human lives as disposable pawns in a silent war for corporate dominance. I walked past the dispatch floor later that evening, feeling the heavy, isolating weight of their skepticism pressing in from all sides, knowing my silence during the weeks leading up to the disaster had earned every bit of their suspicion. Seeking to verify the integrity of our digital records amidst the rising chaos, Rochelle Hayes logged into the core financial database from her workstation to cross-reference the utilization reports Cole had presented to the board. Her fingers flew across the keyboard for several minutes before she froze, staring at the glowing monitor, with a deep frown lines cutting across her forehead. She discovered that entire blocks of historical shipping data from the previous quarter had been systematically altered, and when she dug deeper into the system architecture, automated audit logs revealed that an administrator account had executed a massive export and overwrite sequence at 2 a.m. immediately following the veteran terminations. Rochelle walked straight to my office, her expression tight with controlled fury as she laid the printed audit trail on my desk. She told me that the utilization metrics Cole had used to justify the warehouse liquidations were complete fabrications designed to make our most profitable facilities look like failing assets. She explained that someone with high-level administrative credentials had wiped the original production logs to ensure nobody could prove the warehouses were actually turning a massive profit. Before I could process the gravity of her discovery, Cole strode past my open doorway, flanked by 2 corporate security guards who looked thoroughly uncomfortable executing his sudden commands. He stopped in the threshold, flashing a cold, triumphant grin that reached right up to his dead, calculating eyes. He announced to the room that internal security was conducting a mandatory audit of unauthorized data access and ordered Rochelle to surrender her workstation credentials immediately under threat of immediate termination for corporate espionage. I stood up from my desk, my boots hitting the commercial carpet with a sharp, deliberate sound as I stepped directly between Cole and Rochelle, my posture rigid and unyielding. I told Cole that any attempt to intimidate or interfere with special committee investigators would be met with an immediate court-ordered injunction for witness tampering and evidence destruction. Cole's sneer faltered slightly as he realized he no longer held the executive leverage to bully his way through our defenses, and he stepped back into the hallway, muttering empty threats about legal retaliation before turning on his heel and walking away. Later that night, working late under the harsh glare of my office desk lamp, forensic accountants delivered an initial analysis of the financial paper trail surrounding the mysterious buyer, Blue Cedar Logistics Properties. They traced the source of the earnest money deposit back through a complex web of subsidiary accounts until they hit a private, limited liability company registered in a neighboring state under a different name. Attached to the registration filings was a retainer payment record showing that Exact Shell Company had previously disbursed substantial consulting fees directly to Cole under the vague label of Strategic Advisory Services. The financial puzzle pieces were snapping into place with terrifying clarity, exposing a hidden conflict of interest that Cole had deliberately concealed from the board of directors and the shareholders. He was not merely trying to modernize the company or streamline operational overhead to save a struggling business from financial ruin. He had engineered the entire warehouse sale to benefit a phantom buyer he secretly controlled, utilizing Melissa desperation for cash as a convenient smokescreen to loot company real estate for pennies on the dollar. Rochelle lingered by my office door after the accountants departed, her eyes reflecting the quiet intensity of a woman who had spent a lifetime tracking enemy movements in the signal's intelligence core. She leaned against the doorframe, her fingers adjusting her digital hearing amplifier as she looked past me toward the dark windows overlooking the empty parking lot. She reminded me that while we had successfully frozen the corporate votes and restored the frontline workers to their rightful desks, the manipulated server logs proved that someone inside executive leadership was actively trying to destroy the foundational evidence before we could secure it. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, charged with the dangerous realization that we were racing against an adversary who had administrative access to every file in the building. Rochelle looked directly into my eyes, her voice dropping to a low, steady whisper that carried the absolute weight of undeniable truth. "The numbers Cole showed the board were not our numbers," she said, her words hanging heavy in the silent office. "And someone just tried to make sure we could never prove it." The silence inside the IT recovery suite was thick with the scent of overheated server chassis and stale coffee from the morning pot. Rochelle sat before her primary terminal, her fingers resting lightly on the mechanical keyboard, while the amber status lights of an independent data recovery unit blinked in steady, rhythmic succession against the brushed steel wall. She explained to the special committee members gathered around her desk that our disaster recovery protocol did not rely solely on the internal company mainframes that Cole and his administrative team had spent the past week scrubbing. Under a long-standing insurance and compliance agreement established during my father's early years in business, automated incremental backups were continuously beamed off-site to an independent secure vendor located 3 counties away, completely walled off from local administrator overrides and rogue script commands. Special Committee Counsel had served formal legal hold notices to the off-site vendor less than 24 hours after the audit log discrepancies came to light, securing an immutable snapshot of the network architecture captured precisely 36 hours before the veteran termination event occurred. Rochelle clicked a sequence of authorization keys, and 2 side-by-side windows materialized across the wide, high-definition monitor. On the left side sat the fabricated utilization metrics Cole had presented to the board to justify liquidating our distribution centers as failing assets. On the right side stood the pristine, unedited disaster recovery backup showing the actual freight volume, active transit manifests, and net operating revenue generated by those exact same facilities over the same fiscal quarter. The disparity between the 2 datasets was staggering, stripping away any illusion of administrative error or routine seasonal fluctuation. Luis Alvarez leaned over the back of Rochelle's chair, his weathered hands gripping the synthetic fabric as he tracked the glowing columns of figures that proved his warehouses had never operated at a loss. Whole rows of medical supply shipments, emergency generator dispatches, and cold chain pharmaceutical deliveries had been systematically deleted from Cole presentation deck, replaced with inflated overhead numbers and fictitious maintenance charges that painted profitable distribution hubs as bleeding financial anchors. Forensic accountant Marcus Vance pointed a blunt finger toward the metadata headers embedded within the modified files, noting that every single alteration had been committed using an elite administrative credential assigned exclusively to the Chief Financial Officer office. Multi-factor authentication logs retrieved from the network gateway confirmed that Cole Corporate Laptop had established a direct session with the database core at 2 a.m, executing bulk export routines and overwrite scripts while the rest of the building slept. When confronted with this digital paper trail during a preliminary committee inquiry, Cole had lamely claimed that his executive assistant possessed routine access to his login credentials, but the assistant personnel file and electronic badge swipes instantly demolished that defense, proving she had not even been inside the corporate facility during those early morning hours. I stood near the edge of the conference table watching the digital evidence lock into place, yet the overwhelming clarity of the technical proof brought little comfort as the human cost of our investigation began to bleed outward. Calvin Ward walked into the room carrying a thick sheaf of employee statements, his expression tight and guarded as he laid the papers down beside the forensic reports without making eye contact with me. He told the committee that 3 of our senior logistics dispatchers had officially refused to sign their witness affidavits or cooperate further with the internal probe, their trust shattered beyond repair by the lingering resentment of how the initial termination crisis had been handled. Calvin turned his steady, uncompromising gaze directly toward me, reminding everyone in the room that I had quietly consulted with trust counsel and prepared the emergency financial reserves weeks before Melissa ever signed the firing orders. He asked me bluntly why I chose to keep my strategic preparations a complete secret from the very people whose livelihoods hung in the balance, pointing out that true leadership required sharing the burden of impending danger rather than treating loyal subordinates as unwitting chess pieces in a long-term revenge scheme. I felt the sharp sting of his words settle deep behind my ribs, acknowledging the brutal fairness of his accusation without offering a hollow defense or attempting to soften my past decisions with excuses. My choice to withhold the full picture from the frontline workers had successfully prevented Cole from dismantling the workforce covenant early, but it had also fractured the bedrock of trust between us, leaving deep emotional scars that no amount of legal victory could instantly heal. That fracture quickly spilled out into the broader financial ecosystem when conservative commercial lenders caught wind of our internal dissent and chose to exercise extreme caution. Because several key veteran witnesses hesitated to sign formal affidavits for the special committee, banking partners momentarily delayed granting the emergency debt waivers required to stabilize our operating capital, plunging the company into a genuine cash crunch that threatened to bounce weekly payroll and stall our active freight lines. The artificial crisis Cole had fabricated in his board presentations was suddenly materializing as an authentic operational threat, proving that my calculated secrecy carried a very steep and painful price tag. As the forensic accountants dug deeper beneath the surface of the subsidiary transactions feeding the phantom buyer, they mapped out the suspicious deposit trail that tied Blue Cedar Logistics properties directly to our executive suite. The initial earnest money wire transfers had not originated from a legitimate commercial real estate developer, but rather from a secondary limited liability company formed just weeks after my father passing. Cross-referencing state secretary records with executive expense accounts revealed that this secondary shell company had previously disbursed substantial funds directly to Cole under the deceptive accounting category of strategic.com. Advisory consulting fees, establishing a clear loop of self-dealing where my brother was effectively paying himself out of company accounts to facilitate a below-market asset buyout. The accumulation of hard evidence was undeniable, yet the internal friction continued to mount as different factions within the organization wrestled for control over our next strategic move. Calvin requested a private caucus of the employee trustees to determine whether they should continue pursuing the investigation under my analytical framework or dismiss the current legal advisors and chart an entirely independent course of action. He announced before stepping out of the room that the trustees would hold a formal binding vote the following morning to decide whether my continued involvement as a shareholder liaison was helping our cause or simply reopening old wounds. Among the staff, the office grew deathly quiet as the doors clicked shut behind the departing workers, leaving me standing alone in the dimming twilight of the administrative suite, with the hum of the backup servers echoing like a persistent heartbeat. I walked over to the tall glass windows, looking out across the empty parking lot where my father had spent 2 decades building a legacy based on loyalty, discipline, and mutual respect. The technical data was secure, the financial fraud was mapped, and the legal trap was fully set. But as I stared out into the dark, I knew that tomorrow morning a vote would test whether I had truly learned the difference between commanding an operation and earning the right to stand beside the people who kept it alive. The morning sun cut through the heavy blinds of the main conference room, throwing long, pale stripes across the polished oak table where the employee trustees sat in quiet deliberation. Calvin Ward sat at the center, his hands resting flat against the wood, his expression carved from stone and years of hard discipline. The rest of the board members avoided looking in my direction, their silence heavier and more punishing than any shouted accusation could ever be. I walked toward the front of the room carrying a single brown leather folder, my boots striking the carpet with a measured cadence, stopping a few feet away from the edge of the table. Before any formal vote could be called to determine whether my involvement would be terminated or restricted, I laid the leather folder on the table and slid it open toward Calvin. Inside were no secret memos, no hidden leverage points, and no military directives designed to force their compliance. I had emptied out my personal timeline, placing every single piece of correspondence, every legal inquiry, and every uncomfortable truth right where they could see it. I laid out the initial letter from the Delaware law firm, the exact dates and times of my early warning emails to corporate counsel, the notes from my telephone calls regarding the Emergency Bridge Reserve Fund, and a written accounting of every single thing I knew before the mass terminations occurred, alongside a bold list of everything I had deliberately kept hidden. I looked across the table at Calvin, my voice steady and entirely stripped of defensiveness. I told them plainly that I was not presenting these papers to beg for their trust or to rewrite the choices I had made in the dark. They had every right to strip away my liaison status, and they had every right to lock me out of the investigation entirely if my methods felt too cold or too calculated for comfort. Calvin reached out, his weathered fingers turning over the pages one by one, tracing the dates of my private communications with an intense, forensic focus. The room remained completely dead silent, save for the distant hum of the ventilation system filtering fresh air into the building. After a long, agonizing pause, Calvin looked up from the papers, his eyes narrowing slightly as he asked me the question that had been hanging over the collective consciousness of the workforce since day one. He asked me what my ultimate plan would have been if Article 12 had failed to trigger, if Melissa had managed to find a legal loophole to bypass the workforce covenant, or if Cole internal tampering had successfully destroyed our timeline before the board could intervene. I did not blink, and I did not search for a comforting lie. I answered with absolute candor, telling him that I had possessed no backup plan robust enough to save the company through standard administrative channels, and that my entire strategy had hinged on a high-stakes gamble that the structural integrity of my father contracts would hold under pressure. That admission stripped away the final layer of pretense between us, exposing the raw, unvarnished recklessness of my initial approach. Calvin leaned back in his chair, exhaling a slow, heavy breath that rattled softly in his chest before he turned to confer in low murmurs with the other 4 trustees. They debated for nearly 20 minutes without asking me another question, their voices rising and falling in rhythmic cadences behind closed palms, while I stood quietly by the window, watching the delivery trucks move across the distant loading bays. When Calvin finally turned back to face me, his expression had softened from hostile suspicion into a grim, pragmatic resolve. He announced that the trustees had voted to reject my removal, choosing instead to overhaul our operational governance rules from top to bottom. Under the new resolution, I was formally stripped of any independent executive authority, meaning I could no longer issue directives, negotiate terms, or launch inquiries without the explicit written approval of at least 2 employee trustees. Furthermore, all strategic updates and forensic disclosures had to flow directly through special committee counsel to ensure complete transparency with the frontline staff. I was permitted to remain involved solely as a shareholder liaison, bound tightly by strict ethical oversight and collective governance. I accepted the new boundaries instantly, nodding once to signify my complete agreement without offering a single word of argument or negotiation. With the internal governance crisis temporarily stabilized, Special Committee Counsel turned their full attention toward unraveling the corporate shell structure surrounding Blue Cedar Logistics Properties. Subpoenas issued through civil court combined with state-registered agent records blew the lid off the phantom buyer identity, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the entity had been incorporated by Damian Cross, a former college fraternity brother of Cole who currently operated a boutique real estate holding firm out of a neighboring state. While the initial operating agreement filed with the state did not yet contain the explosive side letter we suspected existed, a careful reading of the foundational bylaws revealed a deeply buried profit-sharing provision guaranteeing a substantial financial kicker to an unnamed corporate advisor once the warehouse properties were successfully acquired and resold below market value. While the legal dragnet tightened around Cole illicit corporate maneuvering, the pressure inside the suburban family home was beginning to fracture the alliance between mother and son. Melissa discovered the hard way that her financial survival had been quietly mortgaged without her full consent, when a senior representative from her primary commercial lender called her directly to discuss the impending default on her personal residential loan. She pulled the physical loan files from her private safe and discovered to her absolute horror that while her personal signature carried the full weight of a rigid personal guarantee on the multi-million-dollar debt, Cole had carefully structured the paperwork so his name appeared nowhere on the liability line. Melissa stormed into Cole executive office late that afternoon, demanding an immediate explanation for why her home and personal assets were standing directly in the crosshairs of a foreclosure action while her son walked away scotangent-free. Cole did not even bother to look up from his computer monitor, dismissing her rising panic with a cold, condescending wave of his hand as he told her that high-stakes business required personal sacrifices, and she should have read the fine print before signing the mortgage riders. That callous betrayal shattered whatever maternal blindness Melissa had maintained toward her son's ambition, leaving her staring at him with a sudden, dawning terror as she realized she had been used as a disposable shield to protect his personal financial exposure. Desperate to find a way out of the trap she had helped construct, Melissa arranged for a private meeting with Damian Cross, hoping to uncover the exact terms of the warehouse acquisition agreement before the special committee subpoenaed the physical files. Damian, terrified that his own real estate license and legal standing were about to be shredded by federal fraud charges, decided to save his own skin rather than protect Cole's secret enterprise. He bypassed my brother entirely and walked straight into the special committee offices, dropping a thick manila envelope onto the conference table containing the missing side letter that had been hidden from the corporate ledger. The document laid out the complete financial blueprint of the conspiracy in cold, unambiguous legal prose, confirming that Cole was slated to receive a massive 40% cut of the post-resale profits, alongside a guaranteed $300,000 consulting fee funneled through the secondary shell company upon the closing of the warehouse transaction. It was the smoking gun we needed, connecting the dots between the fabricated utilization reports, the forced mass terminations, the midnight server overwrites, and the phantom buyer entity into a single, cohesive criminal enterprise orchestrated from the chief financial officer desk. As the special committee legal team processed the newly acquired side letter and prepped the final evidentiary packets for the upcoming special shareholder meeting, an automated alert flashed across the network security terminal in the IT suite. Rochelle ran a routine trace on the outbound email traffic originating from the executive server cluster, and uncovered a hidden message that had been automatically archived within the deleted drafts folder of the corporate buyer. Mailbox. She pulled up the file and transferred it directly to my screen, her eyes wide with grim satisfaction as I read the brief, damning sentence typed out in Cole precise administrative style. Once she signs, she owns the decision. The sender was Cole, and the target of his calculated manipulation was Melissa, confirming that my brother had deliberately maneuvered his own stepmother into signing away her financial independence while ensuring she would take the absolute blame for the illegal termination of the veteran workforce. I sat back in my chair as the full weight of his cruelty settled over the room, knowing that the trap was finally complete and the walls were closing in from every possible direction. The discovery of that digital draft, buried deep within the corporate archives, locked the final, crucial piece of the evidentiary puzzle into place, yet the immediate fallout from its exposure violently transformed the quiet office corridors into a high-stakes battleground driven by sheer desperation. Forensic reviews conducted under the direct, unyielding supervision of Special Committee Counsel meticulously pulled apart the electronic metadata of the correspondence, confirming beyond any lingering shadow of a doubt that Cole had systematically orchestrated the calculated destruction of the veteran workforce, specifically to clear an unhindered path for his private real estate buyers. That single electronic mail message successfully bridged the vast operational divide between the sudden mass firing event and the clandestine Shell Corporation transactions, creating an unbroken, airtight chain of corporate malfeasance that pointed straight to the chief financial officer desk. Further digging through the sprawling corporate document troves unearthed a second damning administrative instruction sent directly from Cole to the Human Resources Director weeks prior to the public announcement. The message contained a cold, unfeeling directive instructing Human Resources to terminate all covered employees in a single, sweeping administrative action rather than utilizing staggered phase-outs, explicitly warning that partial cuts would leave too many operational personnel with active system access and vital institutional memory. The Human Resources Director had wisely preserved that explicit instruction in an independent compliance folder when she recognized its highly irregular and unethical nature, and after Special Committee legal counsel formally guaranteed her absolute, unshakable protection against workplace retaliation and blacklisting, she agreed without hesitation to step forward as a primary witness for the forthcoming shareholder hearings. Melissa found herself completely abandoned by her son as the forensic net tightened around their operations, yet she steadfastly refused to accept any personal accountability for her reckless role in signing the termination warrants. Corporate legal counsel formally delivered a copy of the explicit warning memorandum that had been sent directly to her private inbox hours before she executed the final layoff papers, reminding her that independent review and trustee approvals were legally mandated by the corporate bylaws she had sworn to uphold. Melissa stared at the printed timestamp with a look of stubborn denial, tossing the document back across her polished desk and declaring with haughty arrogance that she had inherited the company outright and did not need permission from a dead man charity committee to manage her own assets. That defiant public declaration permanently erased any lingering sympathy regarding her alleged ignorance of the corporate governance structure, sealing her legal status as a willing and active participant in the boardroom betrayal. Beyond the immediate and bitter employment disputes, the comprehensive forensic audit of company expenditures uncovered a glaring systemic pattern of personal enrichment disguised as routine operational overhead. Financial investigators traced tens of thousands of dollars in corporate disbursements directly to luxury residential renovations on Melissa's sprawling suburban estate, all neatly recategorized under the misleading ledger heading of Founder Legacy Expenses. Additional unauthorized charges included exorbitant private travel expenses, high-end consultant retainers billed by phantom entities, and hefty legal retainers associated with personal loan restructuring maneuvers. While these financial infractions did not immediately trigger criminal indictments, Special Committee counsel integrated them cleanly into the civil litigation framework to establish a textbook case of fiduciary breach and corporate waste ripe for judicial clawback actions. Sensing that the internal walls were closing in and public exposure was becoming an absolute certainty, Melissa launched a desperate counteroffensive through local media channels, attempting to transform the boardroom struggle into a ruthless family coup orchestrated by an ungrateful stepdaughter wearing an army uniform. Reporters from a prominent regional newspaper received anonymous tips alleging that I had leveraged my military credentials to intimidate civilian leadership, seize unwarranted control of family assets, and strip a grieving widow of her rightful inheritance. I refused to engage in a petty mudslinging match through the tabloids, choosing instead to issue a concise, tightly controlled public statement clarifying that the armed forces played absolutely no role in private corporate governance, that I held zero voting control over the enterprise, and that all ongoing administrative reviews were being conducted independently by a legally constituted special committee of employee trustees. Realizing that public sympathy was rapidly slipping through her fingers and the documentary evidence was entirely stacked against her, Melissa initiated a back-channel settlement offer through corporate legal intermediaries, hoping to contain the catastrophic damage before the special shareholder meeting convened. The proposal guaranteed me a permanent voting seat on the board of directors once the protective guardianship period expired, alongside an option to sell back my 10% economic share at a heavily inflated valuation, provided I used my influence to convince the employee trustees to drop the forensic audit and restore Melissa to an honorary executive chairmanship. I rejected the settlement outright, without a single moment of hesitation, but, recognizing that the proposed figures were artificially inflated to mask ongoing asset stripping, and that the fundamental rights of the employee trust were entirely non-negotiable. With all reconciliation efforts permanently dead, and the evidentiary files completely locked down, the employee trust officially issued formal notices scheduling the long-anticipated special shareholder meeting for the first week of February. The official agenda distributed to all stakeholders made it abundantly clear that the displaced frontline workers would take center stage to present their comprehensive investigative findings directly to the ownership block before any formal voting procedures commenced. Melissa swore to anyone who would listen that she would expose the entire proceeding as a fraudulent conspiracy orchestrated by my military background, while Cole retreated behind a thick wall of silence, quietly assembling a counter-report designed to prove the company was hurtling toward immediate insolvency. The evening before the official meeting notices dropped into public distribution, my office telephone rang sharply in the deepening shadows of the administrative suite. I lifted the receiver to hear the breathless, trembling voice of the Human Resources Director, her words tumbling over one another in a rush of sheer, unadulterated panic. She told me that Cole had somehow discovered she was holding the original physical instructions regarding the mass terminations, and moments earlier, he had aggressively pressured office security to release her home address under the false pretense of retrieving misplaced personnel files. The implicit threat of physical intimidation hung heavy in the voice on the other end of the line, reminding me of the desperate measures cornered men would take when their comfortable lives began to unravel. I kept my tone calm and grounded, instructing her not to open her door to anyone under any circumstances, and immediately dispatching special committee security personnel to secure her residence, while special committee counsel sent Cole a formal anti-retaliation and evidence preservation notice, arranged private security for the witness, and began preparing an emergency court application based on his attempt to obtain her home address. There were no dramatic confrontations or midnight pursuits across empty parking lots, only the quiet, unrelenting enforcement of legal boundaries that blocked every aggressive avenue my brother attempted to explore. Over the next 2 weeks, the upper floor of Reeves Freight Recovery became a secured staging ground for the special shareholder meeting. Every document was reviewed for procedural weaknesses, while special committee security ensured that the Human Resources Director could examine records without intimidation. Security logs confirmed that Cole had indeed requested her residential address through a junior administrative portal on the evening prior, but the formal anti-retaliation notice, increased security, and pending emergency court application had effectively blocked his attempt to intimidate the witness on his clumsy attempts at witness tampering. Cole spent those final fortnights retreating behind a fortress of calculated isolation in his corner office, furiously updating his financial solvency counter report in a desperate bid to convince the remaining outside shareholders that Reeves Freight Recovery was hurtling toward immediate bankruptcy. He argued in his dense, self-serving briefs that the unexpected freezing of the pending warehouse sale to Blue Cedar Logistics Properties had severed our primary lifeline of liquidity, leaving the company unable to meet upcoming debt obligations or sustain daily freight operations. He projected a catastrophic cash deficit within 30 days, framing himself as a misunderstood corporate visionary whose prudent asset liquidation plans were being sabotaged by emotional sentimentalists and ungrateful employees. Special committee forensic accountants methodically dismantled his solvency projections line by item during a grueling evening review session in the basement audit room. Marcus Vance traced his finger across the complex debt covenant clauses in Cole Master Report, pointing out that my brother had deliberately miscalculated the terms of our primary commercial credit facility. Cole had treated the temporary standstill agreements negotiated by our banking partners as active default triggers, deliberately inflating our projected short-term liabilities by millions of dollars to manufacture an artificial crisis of insolvency. In reality, our commercial lenders had already agreed in writing to waive immediate repayment penalties and extend a stable bridge credit line as long as the employee trust maintained governance, stability, and independent operational oversight. We did not need to inject personal cash reserves or launch desperate crowdfunding campaigns to keep the trucks rolling across the interstate corridors. The underlying health of our freight network remained robust, driven by steady customer demand and the unmatched efficiency of dispatchers who knew every mile of regional highway better than any automated routing algorithm. Cole's elaborate house of cards was built entirely on manufactured panic, and when the forensic accountants laid out the corrected financial models before the committee, the illusion of impending bankruptcy evaporated completely. While Cole's formula for corporate doom was being systematically dismantled, the alliance between mother and son suffered a final, violent fracture behind the closed doors of Melissa's suburban residence. Melissa finally took the time to read through the physical loan documentation and the recovered side letters that Damian Cross had surrendered to the special committee, uncovering the raw, unadorned mechanics of how her own flesh and blood had manipulated her into assuming total liability for multi-million-dollar debts while reserving all secondary profit shares for himself. She realized with chilling clarity that if the warehouse transaction had closed successfully under Cole's secret specifications, her suburban estate would have faced immediate foreclosure, while my brother quietly pocketed hundreds of thousands of dollars in consulting fees and hidden equity kickbacks. Melissa confronted Cole in the foyer of her home late that evening, her voice carrying through the arched doorways, as she demanded to know why he had exposed her personal assets to absolute ruin while insulating himself from legal exposure. Cole did not bother to lower his voice or offer a soothing parental lie, telling her flatly that she held the majority shares, signed the authorization papers of her own free will, and therefore bore sole responsibility for the administrative fallout. He walked past her toward the front exit without a backward glance, leaving his mother standing alone in the cavernous hallway with the bitter taste of betrayal burning in her throat. The following morning, Melissa arrived unannounced at the corporate headquarters, bypassing the front reception desk and walking straight into my office while I was reviewing the final evidentiary packets with Rochelle. She looked smaller than she had during the memorial service weeks ago, her tailored wool coat hanging loosely around her shoulders, her eyes ringed with the dark shadows of sleepless nights, spent contemplating financial ruin. She closed the heavy wooden door behind her, locked it with a sharp click, and slid a manila folder containing several printed email threads across the corner of my desk. Melissa offered to hand over every single piece of correspondence between herself and Cole regarding the backdoor warehouse negotiations, promising to sign an affidavit testifying to my brother's deceit if the special committee agreed to shield her personal residential estate from civil clawback actions and secure her a modest monthly distribution after the restructuring concluded. I looked down at the folder without touching it, feeling a cold, detached pity rather than any sense of triumphant vindication. I told her plainly that I had no personal authority to grant immunity or broker backroom deals, explaining that all settlement terms and civil liability waivers were governed strictly by the special committee, and had to prioritize full financial restitution for the frontline workers whose lives she had tried to upend with a stroke of hairpin. Melissa's face flushed with a sudden, desperate anger as she realized her attempted bargain was falling on deaf ears. She accused me of being completely devoid of human compassion, screaming that I was deriving sadistic pleasure from watching her family disintegrate piece by piece. I stood up from my desk, walking slowly toward the window that overlooked the quiet loading docks where delivery trucks moved with steady, purposeful rhythm. I reminded her quietly that she had been handed warning after warning by corporate counsel, by the regulatory bylaws, and by me, yet she had consistently chosen arrogance over accountability every single time. She had many opportunities to stop before she signed that termination order, and every consequence she was currently facing was simply the natural weight of her own deliberate choices. She turned and left the office without another word, her heels clicking a sharp, hurried retreat down the carpeted hallway, leaving behind the silent paperwork that documented her dissent. There would be no secret family pacts, no quiet sweeping of corruption under the rug to preserve an unearned public illusion of unity. The institutional machinery was too far along, its momentum driven by hard data, unalterable metadata, and the collective resolve of men and women who refused to be treated as disposable charity cases. With Melissa's desperate plea rejected and Cole counter report thoroughly discredited, Rochelle and Luis finalized the master evidence packet that would anchor our presentation at the upcoming shareholder meeting. Rochelle organized the digital files into 3 distinct, easily digestible modules, separating the fabricated utilization metrics from the pristine disaster recovery backups, while highlighting the exact multi-factor authentication logs that tied the Midnight database, overwrites directly to Cole corporate laptop. Luis cross-referenced every delivery manifest against signed customer receipts, ensuring that the operational profitability of our distribution centers remained unassailable by opposing legal counsel. Calvin drafted the opening statement for the employee trustees, focusing not on corporate jargon or legal technicalities, but on the enduring professional dignity of the men and women who had built the company alongside my father. I spent those final evenings reviewing our strategy with special committee counsel, ensuring every procedural safeguard was firmly in place to prevent any last-minute courtroom theatricals or procedural delays from derailing the proceedings. We mapped out the sequence of presentations down to the minute, verifying that every piece of physical documentation matched its digital counterpart in the official compliance archive. There was no room for error, no margin for emotional outbursts, and no desire for theatrical revenge. The goal was simple, clinical, and absolute. Restore structural integrity to the enterprise, return complete operational autonomy to the workforce, and let the rule of law dismantle the architecture of greed that had threatened to tear the business apart from within. On the evening before the special meeting, I sat alone at my desk after the building had grown completely silent, the amber status lights of the computer monitors casting a soft, steady glow across the walls. I pulled out my father's old service compass from the top drawer, turning the heavy brass casing over in my palm, feeling the cool weight of a tool designed to find true north when all surrounding landmarks were obscured by darkness. I had spent months trying to navigate a family crisis using cold logic and calculated silence, learning the hard lesson that keeping secrets from allies was just another form of control, no matter how noble the initial intent might have felt. The upcoming morning would mark the formal conclusion of the corporate struggle, but it would also mark the beginning of a very different relationship between myself, the company, and the veterans who had every right to demand absolute transparency moving forward. The winter sun rose slowly over Memphis the following morning, burning through a thin layer of morning frost that clung to the chain-link perimeter fences of the Reeves Freight Recovery Facility. Employees and specially invited stakeholders began arriving long before the designated start time, gathering in small, orderly groups outside the main administrative entrance in quiet, respectful anticipation. There were no raised voices, no banners waving in the cold wind, and no hostile confrontations in the parking lot. The atmosphere carried the solemn, measured gravity of a courtroom preparing to hear a verdict that had been decades in the making. I arrived in a tailored civilian suit, keeping my movements deliberate and understated, as I walked through the glass double doors and made my way up the wide staircase toward the primary conference suite. Security personnel checked credentials at the threshold with quiet efficiency, ensuring that only authorized participants entered the main chamber where history was about to be written. The long mahogany table gleamed under the overhead lights, surrounded by dozens of ergonomic chairs that were rapidly filling up with employee trustees, legal counsel, forensic experts, and outside observers representing institutional lending partners. Melissa entered the room shortly before 9 o'clock, flanked by two high-priced corporate defense attorneys who carried bulging leather briefs under their arms. She kept her chin tilted upward in a rigid posture of defiant pride, avoiding eye contact with the administrative staff as she took her designated seat near the front of the table. She looked neither to the left nor to the right, maintaining a mask of icy composure that failed to hide the faint, involuntary twitch of her fingers against her leather portfolio. Cole arrived moments later, walking in with a swift, confident stride that felt entirely performative. He dropped his heavy briefcase onto the table with an audible thud, flashed a quick, dismissive smile toward the special committee counsel, and settled into his chair as if he were attending a routine quarterly budget review rather than a referendum on his professional survival. He pulled out his printed solvency reports, arranging them in neat piles before pulling his laptop toward him with practiced arrogance. I took my seat near the back corner of the room, folding my hands neatly over my leather folio while my gaze swept across the assembly. Calvin Ward entered the room quietly from the rear service corridor, his footsteps steady and measured against the commercial carpet. He walked past the executive seating block without a glance toward Melissa or Cole, took his place at the center of the employee trustee panel, and reached slowly into his coat pocket. He pulled out the worn, battered employee identification badge that had been forcibly ripped from his chest on the day of the mass termination, placing it gently on the wooden surface directly in front of his hands like a quiet, unyielding marker of survival. The chairman of the special committee stood up slowly at the head of the table, his silver hair catching the bright morning light as he surveyed the silent room. He did not offer any welcoming pleasantries or opening remarks about family unity. He reached out, gripped the heavy wooden gavel, and brought it down once with a sharp, resonant crack that echoed against the acoustic ceiling tiles, officially calling the historic gathering to order. The digital recording units hummed softly along the perimeter walls, capturing every frequency as the chairman cleared his throat and addressed the assembly with an absolute, uncompromising authority. Before any corporate attorney presents a single argument today, the chairman announced, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room, the employees who were wrongfully terminated will present what this company was told they cost and what they actually earned. Rochelle stepped up to the main presentation console at the front of the boardroom, her movements calm and deliberate as she connected her secure encrypted drive to the high-definition display monitors. The amber status lights on the interface box blinked twice before casting a crisp, dual-column ledger across the massive wall screens facing the entire assembly. She did not raise her voice or launch into a theatrical opening speech, choosing instead to let the cold, unyielding architecture of the digital data speak for itself. On the left side of the screen glowed the fabricated utilization reports that Cole had presented to executive management during the previous quarter to justify labeling our primary distribution hubs as failing financial burdens. On the right side stood the pristine, unedited disaster recovery backups secured securely from our independent off-site vendor, displaying actual shipment volumes, active transit manifests, and true net operating revenue. Rochelle used a laser pointer to highlight specific line items where entire blocks of medical supply deliveries, emergency generator dispatches, and cold-chain pharmaceutical routes had been systematically erased from the official corporate ledger. She explained how fictitious maintenance fees and inflated overhead charges had been injected into the digital database to transform profitable distribution centers into bleeding liabilities on paper. She pointed directly toward the metadata headers embedded within the modified files, reading aloud the multi-factor authentication logs that proved every single destructive edit had been executed using an elite administrative credential assigned exclusively to the Chief Financial Officer office. The quiet murmurs of shock rippling through the outside legal observers and banking representatives confirmed the complete destruction of Cole Technical Defense. Luis followed her to the podium, his steps heavy and steady as he placed a thick binder of certified customer delivery receipts and independent real estate appraisals directly onto the reading ledge. He addressed the committee with the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades managing high-stress logistics operations under extreme pressure. He walked the assembly through a meticulous breakdown of actual warehouse productivity, contrasting the fabricated stagnation narrative with concrete proof of continuous, profitable activity across every single loading bay. He presented independent third-party market valuations that proved the distribution properties Cole had attempted to sell off below market value to a phantom buyer were actually worth millions more than the contracted purchase price. When Luis concluded his presentation, Special Committee Counsel stepped forward to introduce the smoking gun of the financial conspiracy, sliding the recovered side letter and the shell company incorporation filings directly into the official compliance record. The documents exposed the complete financial machinery of the self-dealing scheme, revealing how Damian Cross had established Blue Cedar Logistics Properties as a front entity designed to acquire company real estate at a massive discount while funneling a guaranteed 40% profit share and a $300,000 consulting fee straight back into Cole private pockets. Special Committee Counsel also highlighted the damning electronic mail message recovered from the deleted drafts folder of the corporate buyer mailbox, reading the exact sentence aloud into the official record for everyone to hear. Once she signs, she owns the decision. Special Committee Counsel read, his voice cutting cleanly through the heavy silence of the boardroom. The weight of those words settled like lead across the executive seating block, turning all eyes immediately toward Cole. My brother sat motionless in his chair, his face draining of all natural color as he realized that every layer of his elaborate deception had been completely stripped away by the documentary evidence. He tried to open his mouth to offer a hurried defense, stuttering that the documents were merely preliminary negotiation concepts that had never been formally executed, but forensic accountant Marcus Vance stepped in immediately to dismantle that feeble excuse. Marcus explained that, under corporate governance statutes, the creation of the shell company, the execution of the deposit wires, and the deliberate concealment of material conflicts of interest constituted an actionable breach of fiduciary duty the moment the transactions were set into motion, regardless of whether the final closing signatures had dried on the parchment. With the financial fraud and executive malfeasance fully exposed, the evidentiary focus shifted decisively toward the human tragedy of the mass termination event itself. Human Resources Director stepped up to the podium, her hands resting calmly on the wooden edges as she faced the assembly with an expression of quiet, enduring resolve. She recounted the morning she received the direct, unfeeling command from Cole instructing her to terminate all covered veteran employees in a single, sweeping administrative action rather than staggered phase-outs. She testified about her deliberate decision to preserve that original physical instruction in an independent compliance folder when she recognized its irregular nature, and she detailed the escalating pressure and intimidation tactics Cole had deployed against her home address just days prior when he discovered she was holding the proof. To silence any remaining skepticism regarding the oral statements made during that fateful morning briefing, Special Committee Counsel queued up the immutable audiovisual record preserved within the secure corporate compliance archive. The high-definition wall monitors flickered briefly before displaying the official Microsoft Teams video recording of the training room meeting, complete with active timestamps, organizer logs, and a verified participant list. The room filled instantly, with the cold, unmistakable sound of Melissa's voice echoing sharply through the high-fidelity speakers as she looked across the rows of seated veterans and delivered her infamous decree. "Fire them all!" Melissa commanded from the screen, her tone dripping with utter disdain before she uttered the slur that stripped away any remaining pretense of corporate restructuring. "We are not running a charity house for broken soldiers." The recording ended after Melissa signed the termination authorization. Special Committee Counsel then displayed the warning email separately, together with its timestamp, delivery record, and Melissa's written response dismissing the need for an independent review. The two records proved different facts. The video captured what she said and signed inside the training room, while the email proved she had been warned before she acted, showing Melissa actively reading the mandatory independent review requirements before picking up a black ink pen and slamming her signature onto the master authorization document anyway. The visual and auditory proof was absolute, welding the financial conspiracy and the wrongful termination events into a single, cohesive narrative of corporate abuse that left no room for legal maneuvering or emotional denial. Calvin stood up slowly from his seat among the employee trustees, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate care before walking toward the center of the room. He did not carry a thick portfolio of financial spreadsheets, and he did not quote complex legal statutes from memory. He simply reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the worn, battered employee identification badge that had been forcibly ripped from his chest on the day of the mass termination, and laid it gently on the wooden surface, directly in front of his hands like a quiet, unyielding marker of survival. He looked across the silent room, his gaze passing over the high-priced defense attorneys, pausing for a brief second on Cole's panic-stricken expression, and finally resting squarely upon Melissa's wide, fearful eyes. Calvin spoke in a measured, gravelly register that commanded absolute silence from every corner of the suite, explaining that my father had built Reeves Freight Recovery not out of charitable pity or paternalistic altruism, but because he understood that the unique discipline, resilience, and logistical genius forged in military service represented the absolute finest asset any company could ever hope to employ. He recounted how Frank Reeves had learned to trust them with the core operations of the enterprise, and how they had spent 2 decades keeping the supply chains moving through blizzards, floods, and economic crises, without ever asking for special favors or preferential treatment. Calvin turned his attention directly toward Melissa, his voice carrying a quiet, devastating weight that needed no shouting to be heard. "You thought you were cleaning house," Calvin said, his eyes locked onto her trembling form. "You thought you were erasing a few expensive reminders of a husband who loved this work more than he loved his own comfort. But every single name on that termination list represents a human being who built the very walls holding this roof over your head. You cannot inherit the people who built the shares, and you certainly cannot fire the foundation." He stepped back from the table, leaving his battered badge resting quietly on the polished wood like a silent indictment that demanded immediate resolution. The chairman of the special committee did not wait for closing arguments from the defense attorneys, recognizing that the mountain of digital metadata, forensic audits, recovered side letters, and audio-visual compliance records had completely obliterated any possible counter-argument. He called for an immediate formal vote among the 5 employee trustees to execute the final remedial actions mandated by the governing bylaws and the emergency restructuring framework. The 5 trustees cast their binding votes in rapid, uninterrupted succession, their decisions echoing clearly through the recording equipment with the finality of a falling hammer. They voted unanimously to strip Melissa of her executive chairmanship and remove her permanently from the board of directors without severance, suspend her distributions pending the civil accounting, and authorize recovery of any company funds used for personal expenses. They voted unanimously to terminate Cole for severe cause, immediately revoking all administrative access credentials, stripping away his unvested stock options, initiating formal civil clawback proceedings to recover all unauthorized consulting fees, and authorizing special committee counsel to transmit the complete investigative file to the appropriate state and federal authorities for independent review of potential fraud, undisclosed self-dealing, and evidence tampering. They voted unanimously to restore permanent employment status, full seniority rights, and complete back pay benefits to every single veteran employee affected by the illegal purge, while also establishing an independent executive search committee to appoint a qualified professional chief executive officer who understood the true operational DNA of the company. As the final vote was tallied and recorded into the official minutes, Melissa spun around in her chair, her face contorted in a mask of hysterical panic, as she lashed out directly toward where I sat quietly near the back of the room. She screamed at the top of her lungs that I had engineered the entire catastrophe from the shadows, accusing me of using my military background as a Trojan horse to steal her inheritance and destroy her family. I did not flinch, and I did not raise my voice to match her frantic shrieking. I stood up slowly from my chair, my movements calm and deliberate as I buttoned my suit jacket and walked toward the edge of the assembly area. I looked straight into her desperate, bloodshot eyes and answered with absolute finality, delivering the exact words that would forever close the chapter on their reign of corporate pillaging. "I prepared for what you might do," I told her, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "You still had to choose it." When the trustees formally turned toward me to ask if I wished to assume the role of interim chief executive officer during the transitional stabilization phase, I shook my head and declined the offer without a moment of hesitation. I explained clearly to the board that my active military service obligations required my full attention, that I possessed no prior corporate management experience running a major logistics enterprise, and that true institutional healing required an independent leader completely detached from family bloodlines. I affirmed that I would happily retain my 10% economic ownership share as a committed shareholder, and I agreed to serve strictly as an ethical shareholder liaison within the tight boundaries established by the special committee governance rules. The meeting was officially adjourned with a single resonant strike of the wooden gavel, signaling the formal end of the ownership struggle that had threatened to tear the enterprise apart from within. As the assembly began to disperse, and outside observers filed quietly out into the hallway, Special Committee Counsel walked briskly over to where Cole was aggressively packing his laptop and solvency reports into his leather briefcase. Counsel handed my brother a thick manila envelope containing the newly minted civil summons and complaint, speaking in a calm, matter-of-fact tone that cut straight through his frantic denial. "The civil case starts today," Special Committee Counsel told him, his voice entirely devoid of malice. "The criminal referral has already left this building." Cole stopped dead in his tracks, the blood draining completely from his face as he stared down at the legal summons resting atop his briefcase, finally grasping the terrifying reality that losing his executive title and corporate salary was merely the opening chapter of the legal consequences waiting to consume him. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom closed behind the departing legal teams, leaving the executive suite wrapped in a profound, steady silence. Over the next month, the special committee installed an independent interim chief executive officer who understood that running Reeves Freight Recovery required honoring my father's foundational blueprint. Disagreements over warehouse, automation, and routing were resolved transparently through the employee trust rather than arbitrary executive decrees. Civil litigation against Cole accelerated rapidly during the spring. Facing an insurmountable mountain of server logs, forensic metadata, and authenticated email threads proving his premeditated corporate sabotage, Cole negotiated a comprehensive civil settlement. Under a court-approved civil settlement, Cole returned the unauthorized consulting payments, surrendered his unvested stock options, reimbursed a negotiated portion of the forensic and legal expenses, and accepted a 10-year ban from serving as an officer or director of Reeves Freight Recovery. Meanwhile, criminal referral packages landed on prosecutor desks. Damian Cross turned state witness, and Cole ultimately accepted a formal plea deal with the district office. At his sentencing hearing in a crowded federal courtroom, the federal judge imposed a brief term of incarceration followed by extended home confinement, mandatory financial restitution, and a multi-year ban from managing corporate accounts. Melissa faced a different form of accountability. Investigators found no evidence that she knew about Cole's hidden profit share, but the records proved that she knowingly ignored legal warnings, authorized the mass termination, withheld employee compensation, and used company funds for personal expenses. Nevertheless, her accountability required disgorging unauthorized disbursements used for her suburban estate renovations. Because her commercial loan matured without the rescue of the fraudulent warehouse sale, Melissa faced absolute foreclosure. She sold her multi-million-dollar property, retreated into a modest 2-bedroom condominium, and later called my private line, weeping for a financial stipend. I listened to her grief, but remained unyielding, explaining that corporate assets were earmarked to maintain operational stability and compensate the frontline workers she had harmed. Months later, during a routine quarterly review, I drafted an email containing structural freight routing recommendations for the board. Remembering Calvin's sharp reprimand from our past struggles regarding the line between strategic counsel and unauthorized commands, I paused, deleted the authoritative phrasing, and reframed the correspondence as a collaborative recommendation for independent evaluation. An hour later, Calvin called me, and we spent 20 minutes debating logistics like two seasoned professionals working toward a shared objective. Before hanging up, he thanked me for respecting governance boundaries, reminding me that my true value lay in standing shoulder to shoulder with the workforce. By autumn, Reeves Freight Recovery released a glowing first-quarter financial report under the new Employee Integrated Governance model. The distribution warehouses Cole tried to auction off as dead assets were operating at peak capacity, generating record quarterly revenues. The Employee Trust conducted its first democratic election cycle, voting warehouse supervisors and veteran dispatchers onto the permanent board of directors. During a solemn ceremony on the anniversary of my father passing, the board rebranded the Internal Support Initiative as the Reeves Workforce Recovery Fund. On a crisp October afternoon, I walked into the administrative offices, which now hummed with the steady cadence of productive labor. Resting inside a polished wooden shadow box in the reception foyer was the worn employee identification badge Calvin had laid on the boardroom table during our crisis, placed beside a certified copy of Article 12. They stood as sobering reminders of a foundational truth. Calvin stepped out and walked quietly up beside me, asking softly if I still believed I made the right tactical choice by refusing to warn Melissa before she signed her own professional execution warrant. I looked back at him with a steady gaze, knowing the crucible of the past year had forged absolute clarity. I told him I made the correct decision by refusing to rescue Melissa from the natural consequences of her own deliberate choices, while acknowledging I was wrong to withhold vital operational context from frontline workers who deserved transparency from the beginning. Two opposing truths could occupy the exact same space, and navigating that imperfect reality was my father's true legacy. Melissa and Cole had inherited physical shares through biological good fortune, believing legal ownership granted them absolute dominion over human lives. What they never understood, and what their calculated greed destroyed them for ignoring, was a simple, immutable reality. No one inherits the people who built them. When you watch people fight over inheritances and corporate titles, you might think wealth is measured by the sheer volume of shares held in a portfolio or the imposing height of office walls. But true power and survival in this world have never belonged to those who merely hold the keys to a building or a bank account. You learn very quickly that paper titles can be revoked overnight, bank accounts can be frozen by court order, and executive titles can be stripped away the moment a boardroom votes to cut the dead weight. Real security does not come from what you inherit on a legal document or what you can seize through cunning manipulation and deceit. You realize that a thriving enterprise, a lasting family, and a genuine community are built entirely by the people who show up every single day and do the actual work. Those workers who carry the operational memory, who keep the supply chains moving through freezing ice storms and midnight crises, are the true foundation of any lasting success. If you ever find yourself responsible for leading others, you must remember that you cannot buy loyalty with corporate buzzwords. And you certainly cannot treat human beings like disposable tools in a game of power. True authority is earned through absolute transparency, mutual respect, and an unshakable willingness to stand shoulder to shoulder with the people who build your success from the ground up. When arrogance blinds a person into believing they possess absolute dominion over others, they inevitably engineer their own destruction. You cannot trick the system forever, and you cannot inherit the dedication of the people who built your foundation because human dignity is never for sale. As you reflect on the heavy cost of greed and the quiet, steady strength required to do what is right, think about your own life and the relationships you hold dear. Have you ever trusted someone who promised you everything, only to realize too late that they valued your position far more than your humanity? And how did you finally find the courage to walk away?